The biggest legislative change affecting your retirement since 2006, the Secure Act will change your RMD, will change your 401k, and maybe even your estate plan. Listen to learn more. Hello, this is Patrick Carlson, and I'm a Vice President of Wealth Services here at Advisor Investments. We're here with another Advisor You Can Talk To podcast. Today I'm joined by my colleague, Bob Lepson, a certified financial planner and wealth manager. Hi, Bob.
Hello, Patrick. Great to be here today.
Thanks. And also Geoff Turner, an account manager here at Advisor Investments. Hi, Geoff.
Hi, Patrick. Thank you for having me today.
Today, we're going to be discussing the newly enacted Secure Act, which has been billed by many as the biggest legislative change since the Pension Protection Act of 2006. You know, this bill, earlier in the year, many of us didn't think it was actually going to be enacted. It passed by an overwhelming margin in the House, and then it seemed to be kind of on the rocks, like it wasn't going to happen. And then here at the last minute, Congress pulled it out and passed it along with some kind of must-pass budget types of items. So we're all a little bit still absorbing the impact of that, but we wanted to get this out there to you because we know you're seeing a lot of news reports and hearing a lot of things about how this is going to impact you, your financial plan, and your estate plan. So, let's talk with some of the big changes to your financial plans. I know one of the big ones that I've seen a lot of news reports on is on the RMDs, now starting at 72, which seems like a big deal, but maybe isn't quite as big a deal as we think. What do you think about that, Bob?
I think delaying the required minimum distribution date until age 72 can be very helpful for folks who are looking to defer their retirement accounts. Additionally, if they've got other sources of income, that can be helpful and useful at the moment.
I mean, one of the things that's helpful here, obviously, is that it's a little bit of time for investments to remain in that tax-deferred account if you're not using them. The downside of this, at least from my math and looking at it, is that from a practical perspective, it really is somewhat minimal. I mean, if you were born in the second half of the year, as I was born in September, my first year of RMDs would actually be when I turned 71. So I went from 71 to 72. I mean, it's not exactly an earth-shattering change, really. I guess if you're born in the first half of the year, you get 2-year extension, right? Because you would have been 70 that first year. So, I mean, it's not a huge deal. It's being billed as a huge thing, but it's really a relatively minor change. I think the biggest part of it is going to be a lot of clients are calling me confused about exactly when they turn 70 and a half, because you have to kind of really think about that, whereas turning 72 is something most people are going to really be able to readily recognize what happens to them.
Correct. I mean, the legislation says that folks will need to begin to take distributions from their retirement accounts in the calendar year that they turn 72. And one thing that did not change is that folks are going to be able to continue to postpone that until the following year, and will still need to be able to distribute by April 1 as well. No difference from the current legislation.
For sure. I think here, one of the things too that I've heard is, a lot of people have been asking, well, what if I just started my RMDs? Am I allowed to, those required distributions, am I allowed to stop? Say that person who turned maybe 70 and a half on New Year's Eve or a Christmas Day or something like that at the end of 2019. Is that person required to continue their distributions, or are they able to kind of stop them until they turn 72?
No, they will be required to continue their distributions. There'll be no change for the folks who have already started their required distributions in 2019. This law will only affect folks turning 72 in the year 2020 or beyond.
So if the luckiest people out there are probably those who are turning 70 and a half on January 1st, 2020, because they got the great extension from the new law. The worst outcome are those who turn 70 and a half on New Year's Eve. Got it. So one of the other things that's interesting here is the IRS has been working regulatorily on retirement planning as well, and they proposed some new life tables. Now, again, I think those are only scheduled to become final in 2021 is when we'd start using them. But again, another big change. It's been nearly 20 years since they revised those life tables. Can you tell us a little bit about how you think those are going to impact people's RMDs?
In a very, very modest way. So the new life tables that are being proposed will extend the amount of time ever so slightly for required distributions. For the most part, it probably won't be all that noticeable, but I guess theoretically there'll be a slightly smaller distribution that will be required initially.
That's a great point, Bob. One thing that hasn't changed is that you can still continue to make your qualified charitable distributions at age 70 and a half.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. I mean, so we're going to have some clients that are going to be looking at that from the financial planning perspective, saying, should I do a QCD? Even though a lot of times in the past it was about, well, you've got this required distribution, and if you don't need the money and you're feeling charitable, it's a way for it to kind of sidestep the tax return. So it doesn't really maybe bump up your Medicare premiums or cause some kind of other issue. But here now we're going to have that little bit of a window where we could make a qualified charitable distribution, but we're not required to pull any money out. So I think that'll be a kind of an interesting little twist on some of the financial plans for some of our clients. Absolutely.
It will be also interesting to see if at some point over the course of the next year or two that Congress decides to make the QCD age consistent with the required distribution age.
No, absolutely. I mean, I suspect we probably will see some kind of corrections bill or some kind of supplemental bill to this as the kinks get worked out, as it becomes implemented by the IRS and others.
Yeah, another interesting thing about the qualified charitable distributions and the new age requirement change is that people can now still contribute to their IRAs after age 70 and a half, which is an important fact. That's what the legislation has just changed as well.
Now, Geoff, you mean traditional IRAs, the kind that we would deduct, because I think you were always able to continue to make Roth contributions, right?
Exactly. You're 100% correct. Thank you very much. Yes. For traditional IRAs now, after age 70 and a half, if you're still working, you can still make contributions to those plans, where previously we weren't able to do that. But regarding qualified charitable distributions, what the government has done now is they've actually closed down a little bit of a loophole where if you're still making those contributions to your IRA, those can't be counted towards those charitable distributions as well. So what we would advise you do is, and everybody's situation is going to be a little bit different, please talk to your advisor to see what is going to be the best course of action for you, because there are some loopholes and some trap points that could possibly trip you up and not give you the taxable donation that you think that you're actually qualifying for.
Absolutely. You know, another thing that I saw in the bill that I thought was interesting was a new category of ways to have a penalty-free withdrawal before your retirement. And this is for qualified birth and adoption distributions. And again, it's limited. It's only $5,000. It's also only penalty-free, so you still have to pay tax if you're pulling out, IRA or traditional money. If you're pulling out traditional money here, again, I think there's some pretty important financial planning considerations before you choose to do this. Definitely want to talk to an advisor about that before you would ever make that choice.
Yeah, and I'm very glad that you emphasized on penalty-free. The government does not consider taxes to be a penalty. That is just a birthright for all of us. The penalty portion is going to be, usually what happens is that if you were going to take money out of your retirement account before age 59 and a half, there's a 10% penalty for being allowed to do so, in only certain situations where you can. One of the new provisions of the law is that adoption or the birth of a child is now considered a eligible reason to be able to take out a distribution of your plan. You can do so up to $5,000 per child per parent. And that's also replenishable, so if you have more children, either adopt through adoption or through birth, you can then take out that money again. Like you said, taxes are always going to be applicable no matter what. Just a 10% penalty will be waived for you to do so. For you to be able to take the distribution from your IRA for birth of a child or adoption of a child, you can do so penalty-free, but the taxes will be applicable to it. You can also possibly replenish that loan. You can repay that back over a certain amount of time. Now that time frame hasn't been decided upon yet, so that'll be information more coming about that in the few years.
And that would be different than a 60-day rollover traditionally.
Absolutely, because it's also not only is it that you can put the money back, but it's also going to be in addition, above and beyond contributions that you make over the course of the year. Again, it's a situation that if you're in this spot and you're taking this out, this will also be considered a last resort for you, because you are losing the compounding possibility on the IRA account. And if you're taking that money out, in all honesty, people have great intentions, but the fact that may be repaid is slight, unfortunately.
Certainly there are additional financial responsibilities when children come along. It makes repaying much more difficult.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Of course, SECURE is a retirement bill. The name of the bill is actually Setting Every Community Up for Retirement Enhancement Act of 2019. So any kind of retirement type of bill, of course, it's going to talk about 401ks somewhere in there. So, Bob, I know there were some really big changes on 401ks that you had looked at. Can you give us kind of a summary of what those are?
One of the changes that I've noticed for 401k plans is that it will be easier for annuities to be included in these plans due to a new safe harbor provision.
So, Bob, what do you mean by a safe harbor in that context?
So previously, many employers were hesitant to include annuities in their 401k plans because they feared that some insurance companies could potentially go bankrupt and then they would be sued by their employees for a breach of fiduciary responsibility.
So if I'm understanding correctly, so if an employer follows all the rules and regulations that are set forth by the government, if something happens above and beyond something that's unforeseen, they're not going to be held liable for everything. They're safe.
Exactly right, Geoff. Second provision that I noticed for 401k plans is that it will now be easier for small businesses to establish and maintain plans on behalf of their employees because they will be able to participate in something that is called a multiple employer plan.
Yeah, so it's a bunch of it, like imagine company A, B, C, and D. Instead of each one of them having to set up their own plan and pay their own costs and everything, they can all set up one kind of master plan, if you think about it, for all four of them to participate in. And the law kind of, I think, removed some obstacles that were present before for setting up those plans. And it gives, also your employers are going to get a tax credit for this. So it's going to hopefully encourage them to set up those plans. So if you're a listener and you work for a small employer that maybe hasn't had a 401k option for you before, it's the intent of this law is that it's going to expand that and make it so that way maybe you can have access as soon as they get one set up.
Exactly, Patrick. And then finally, a third provision that was added is that employees will be eligible to participate in 401k plans as part-time employees. Currently, there's a 1,000-hour requirement per year for an employee to be able to participate in a 401k plan. And with the Secure Act, that has been lowered to 500 hours, which is a very, very part-time type of employment.
Yeah, so that'll really help a lot of our clients that have that, primary earner spouse, and then they've got another spouse that, has a career. They're working outside the home, but they're doing it in a part-time kind of way. And before, really, their only option was that IRA. And now maybe they'll be able to participate in that employer plan, which will be really helpful.
They'll be able to participate in the plan and also be eligible potentially for employer contributions, which will certainly help their balance grow more quickly.
Yeah, for sure. The other thing, too, that you didn't mention in there that I think is also going to be really interesting, although it's going to be a bit delayed, is we're going to see some changes on our 401k statements in the future as well. The law requires that regulations be written to address what they call the lifetime income disclosure. And so this is going to be an additional sort of number that we'll see on our 401k statements that will tell us if we were to annuitize using the rules that the government provides, our 401k balance, annuitize that 401k balance, what our sort of annual payout would be. I think here, the big thing I'm going to be watching for is exactly what those rules call for, because, I have no idea what kind of assumptions they're going to be using to calculate that number. That might be a good fit for some people. For other people, it's not going to be a good fit. I think that's going to be something where before you ever choose that option, you're definitely going to want to talk to a financial planner to make sure that you're getting a solution that works for you and for your goals rather than just being enticed by a particular number you might see on there, which may be a completely unrealistic number. Again, we don't have regulations on this yet. This is going to be something that is going to take a year or more for them to implement probably.
Exactly. And the insurance industry who provides these annuities will also most likely develop specific annuity products that are designed specifically for 401k plans that will have most likely lower expenses, may have fewer or no surrender charges, things that are going to be much more advantageous for the client.
Yeah, we might see those kinds of things. And again, it just comes back to making sure that when you get that new disclosure or new document from your employer or its 401k provider, and it says, here's this new option, talk with us first. We're happy to chat about any of the investment options that you have available and give you some guidance and some way to chart the course for yourself.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. That's that new statement when that starts coming out. I think it's very, very important. We've said it a few times as we, through our discussion here. Things can be a trap, but it's very important for our listeners not to misconstrue what that projection is. It actually is a projection. It's not a guarantee. It's a projection of things that could possibly be, not that will be.
For sure. So that kind of wraps up, I guess, some of the key highlights that we saw from a financial planning perspective. And of course, the law also, because it's changing our retirement account, which for many of us is our largest asset or one of our largest assets, there's also an estate planning dimension to the Secure Act. One of the biggest changes that you may have seen in the media on this is this new 10-year payout rule for designated beneficiaries. So, of course, the designated beneficiary is just, the beneficiary we name. It's our son, our daughter, our spouse, whoever that may be. But the law actually adds a new term. It calls them eligible designated beneficiaries. Now, the important thing to remember here is that if you're an eligible designated beneficiary, you get to keep the old rules. So the lifetime stretch rules rather than that new 10-year rule where you have to take everything out within 10 years. Now, the eligible designated beneficiaries list is very short. It includes surviving spouses, disabled people, again, subject to the IRS's definition of disability, chronically ill people, again, also subject to the IRS definition of chronically ill, and then people who are no more than 10 years younger than you. So there, think of like if you were leaving your estate to maybe siblings or cousins that are around your same age.
So for these folks, there's no change whatsoever in the amount of time that they're going to be able to maintain the inherited IRAs.
Well, so those people, the amount of time they'll be able to maintain it is based on their life expectancy.
Got it.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, the key takeaway here is that obviously it's time for us to check those beneficiary designations. I mean, a lot of us, a lot of the clients that I've worked with over time have named a trust as a beneficiary on their IRA. Those require kind of immediate review to make sure that the trust isn't creating sort of a tax time bomb. A lot of these trusts were written to say, don't take out any money until the government forces you to take it out, and then when you take it out, give it to the beneficiary. Under the old rules, that was fine because we got that lifetime stretch. But under these new secure rules, unless it's for like a surviving spouse, here the rule is going to say hold the thing in, take all of the money, hold the money in the IRA, in 10 years, take it all out, and then pay a giant tax bill 10 years from now and give it all over to the beneficiary. Hardly the intent of most of the clients I've worked with over time. So those are something that you definitely, reach out to your financial advisor, find out what the beneficiary designation is. If it names a trust, then we just need to get on the phone and discuss, walk through it with you and your attorney to make sure that we get it updated properly. The other part of it is minors that you've named as beneficiaries. So maybe you've named children, maybe you've named grandchildren. There's a sort of a little bit of a trap here for some people. If I name my actual child, they're able to follow the old rules until they reach the age of majority, and then they're stuck with the 10-year payout. Whereas a grandchild is always stuck with the 10-year payout. So I'll use an example. Let's suppose I decide to leave my IRA to my 2-year-old son, and I pass away in 2020. My 2-year-old son would, until he turns 18, he would have the required minimum distribution rules. Once he turns 18, he's stuck with the 10-year distribution. Still sounds kind of bad, but again, he got 26 years of total stretch out of this thing. So not as advantageous as the pre-Secure Act rules, but also not as draconian as the 10-year payout. Now, let's suppose that my parents, so my son's grandparents, decided to leave the IRA to him. Well, he's stuck with the 10-year payout. So we're going to have to pull out all of that money by the time he hits 12, and that could be a tax disaster for a lot of families. So that's another one you're definitely going to want to check.
One tip that I would also like to pass on to everybody is to please check your beneficiaries to make sure that your accounts are set up exactly the way that you would like them to be set up. I've noticed over the years that sometimes things change for people, either situations, relationships change. It's always a good idea to check who your beneficiaries are on an annual basis. Well, it's a very simple process to change now, very difficult to change after the fact.
Yeah, and we're entering that, that's a great point, Geoff. We're entering that time of year where we're already kind of unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, doing your tax return. And so that's an easy extra little thing to add. You're already going to be potentially having to talk to us about getting your 1099 or questions about that. Just add a little note to say, hey, grab your beneficiary designation at the same time if you don't already have it.
Patrick, speaking of minors,
Yeah.
there was also a change in the kiddie tax rules as part of Secure as well, correct?
Absolutely, there was. So what happened in the act is we basically repealed the changes to the kiddie tax that were enacted by the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. So Congress said, oops, just kidding, never mind. We went back to the laws that existed before 2018, which is advantageous for most people that were paying that tax. Again, for those of you who aren't familiar with the kiddie tax, it basically applies if you have a child, a minor child, who has unearned income. So maybe we've given stocks, bonds, a business interest, that type of thing to that child, and they're earning that unearned income. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act imposed a pretty draconian tax on that, and Congress decided that they didn't want to continue with that path. So they just basically repealed it. And in fact, there's even a provision in there to allow you to retroactively go back and refile 2017 and 18 tax returns using the new rule. So that's going to be an option to maybe consider or look at depending on your situation. It could be advantageous. It might be not advantageous. It's something you just have to check out for yourself. So, kind of going back to the estate planning piece here, some of our clients will sometimes have charitable interests and charitable goals as part of their estate plan. And there is one tool that might gain some renewed interest here, and these are those charitable remainder trusts. The idea here would be you name the beneficiary of your IRA as one of these charitable remainder trusts, and then the trust itself liquidates the entire IRA. It doesn't have to pay any tax because of the tax rules that those trusts have at that time. The downside of these trusts is that you have to basically set aside a sufficient amount to charity for it to qualify. It has to have a certain amount of charitable value. There's also limitations on how much income you can pay the beneficiaries. Also, they have some costs associated with managing them over time. So you have to have a big enough IRA balance. You've got to have a charitable intent. You've got to have beneficiaries that you think are going to live long enough. But as long as the numbers coincide and work out for you, this could be an option for a lot of families that want to use, that maybe have a modest traditional IRA or even a large traditional IRA balance that have that charitable intent. I could see these having some renewed interest on the part of some families.
Exactly. They can certainly not entirely replace the stretch provision for beneficiaries, but they can come close to mimicking some of the current payouts and how long those payouts can last for beneficiaries as well.
Now, Patrick, you did also mention moderate or large. Just as a point of reference or for a ballpark estimate, what would be considered moderate or large?
That's a great point, Geoff. I mean, a lot of people are scratching their heads going, what should I do and how quickly do I need to react to this law? And I would say, let's say a small IRA balance, these are basically unaffected. I kind of think of that as maybe 100 to 150. That's an amount where the amount of time and effort and cost that would go into doing extensive planning is probably wasted given the balance. Medium IRAs, let's call that maybe 250 to 300. Largely unaffected. It kind of depends on how many beneficiaries you have. If you have one, we probably should talk. If you have four, probably a little less important, right? I would say that's a somewhat moderate to-do item. Maybe get to it in the summer, unless it's really bothering you, then do it early. The people who really have to worry are those large, let's say, up to, getting into that $500,000 to $750,000 or $500,000 to $1 million range. Those people need to put some urgency, and the people who absolutely need to act immediately and take some action because of Secure are people with those extra large or large IRA balances over $1 million. Those are the people that really need to get in and talk to their advisors as soon as possible. And, thinking about how to kind of maximize the value of these retirement accounts to your family as well is, many of our listeners are familiar with Roth conversions. We've talked about them a lot. You probably see it in the news talked about as well. If you're using your retirement accounts as a legacy tool, if your plan here is to say, I don't need this money. I've got plenty of other money. I've got plenty of income, and I really want to be able to pass these accounts on to my children, grandchildren, or other beneficiaries. Roth conversions have now become that much more powerful, especially if you're subject to the estate tax, either at the state level or at the federal level, if you live in a state with a state estate tax. It lets us prepay that tax, is what basically the Roth lets us do. And it makes that 10-year payout a lot less harsh from a tax perspective for the beneficiary. So those Roth conversions, especially if you're using these as a legacy tool to pass along, again, that's that large or extra large balance that we just talked about with Geoff. Really important to look at that. Now, for clients that are using these for their retirement purposes, they're planning to spend the money. It's probably a little bit less important. It's the same math it's always been. You know, what's your investment horizon? What's your tolerance for risk? Do you have the outside assets to pay the tax? You know, the same types of things we've been talking to you about for years when it's come to Roth conversions. They make sense sometimes, and other times they don't make sense. So don't just reflexively go and hit the convert button when you log into your account or something like that. Definitely talk to somebody. But we're going to see those having increased value, especially for a legacy piece.
And keep in mind when you're doing Roth conversions or considering Roth conversions that it's not an all or nothing type of arrangement. You can certainly do partial Roth conversions, and you can do a series of Roth conversions over the course of 5, 8, 10 years, whatever works from a tax planning perspective.
You know, and one of the other things that I've been talking with some clients about as well is, you know, sadly that there are always some people who are ill and who will pass away shortly after this law is enacted, and that we're going to have to immediately start thinking about how do we administer an estate where somebody's inherited here. And we're already having some of those discussions with some clients. And, you know, obviously with that 10-year rule for most beneficiaries, you know, the easy options that have come to mind from some of the clients have been, gosh, I'm going to take it out all at once right now and just be done with it. Some say, well, gosh, I'll just leave it in there and take it out in the 10th year. And others are saying, well, I'll just take 10% per year. You know, the first option, they're taking it all out up front, usually terrible for tax purposes. Waiting until year 10 is also pretty bad for tax purposes. You're probably going to want to spread this out over a couple of years for what we call bracket management. And by bracket management, what I mean is, you know, those income tax brackets, so we're not really loading up with too much income in any year and causing it to be excessively taxed. You know, here, 10% a year, maybe that's the right approach, but for a lot of the clients that I've been sort of running some initial numbers for, we really need to be looking at that calculation every year. Because, of course, rare is the client that earns the exact same income every single year. It's just not very common. So, you know, we're going to want to be doing that. This is especially important for those of you who have those large and extra large IRAs where if we're having to distribute, you know, over $1 million over that period, plus the investment gains that it's hopefully going to have, we're going to really need to make sure we watch those brackets. This really is an education point for your beneficiaries, and it's also an important reason for us to make sure that we're able to connect with them, even if it's just a chance to kind of meet the beneficiaries, generally describe the plan to them. If we're having some kind of family meeting, that can be a really, really helpful time to explain that these rules are different. This is a sort of uncharted territory for everybody. And we're going to see some, you know, people that make mistakes and it's going to cost them, and we're going to see other people that are thoughtful and careful about this, and they really maximize the opportunities available under the new law.
Yeah, so it sounds like the bracketology method that you just described sounds very similar to a lot of our listeners who may be doing quarterly estimated taxes now. A lot of the same process involved with that?
Yeah, it's going to be, you know, if you're already making quarterly estimated payments, I mean, you know, the same type of math and logic that goes into it, it would be used here to decide how much to convert and when. So a lot of times it's going to be the same type of calculation or a similar calculation involved.
Again, this is going to be something, a lot of changes on these, on the new legislation is very sweeping, but it's going to be something that's going to be detailed to your specific situation. So always be sure to talk to your advisor and about what exactly needs to be done in your situation.
Absolutely. So, you know, we have gone over a lot of information in today's podcast, and I know sometimes it's a lot to absorb. So I want to kind of summarize with just a couple of the key next steps and some of the kind of key takeaways. I mean, if you've got that large IRA balance, you know, you probably should talk to the financial planner sooner rather than later about the law's impact and whether you're going to need to do some updates on your estate plan. As that 401k investment choice, if your plan begins to offer an annuity, once you receive some kind of notice on that, it's always a good idea to double check with your investment and financial advisor about those options before just reflexively deciding to switch into it. For those of you who are thinking about Roth conversions, again, we say it a lot, but you know, preliminary indications here are that these are going to have a lot of increased value for certain types of clients, and it didn't really change the math for other types of clients. So that's something where we really need to run a personalized analysis for you. The other key takeaways of the law: with the RMD age changing, if you were already taking your RMDs, you're just going to continue taking RMDs. However, for those of you who weren't already 70 and a half by December 31st, 2019, now you get to wait until you're 72 to start those RMDs. Again, the key takeaway here, as you're thinking about your New Year's resolutions, if you didn't add Think About Secure Act, go ahead and add that to your list and give us a call. We're happy to talk about the law's impact on you and your situation. Bob, Geoff, any other closing comments you'd like to add?
Certainly, you mentioned earlier the annuity provisions that are part of this plan or part of this act for 401ks. Annuities are pretty complex, and there's going to be additional regulation and provisions that will be put forth by the government. And as these changes are announced, we'll certainly stay on top of them and provide you with updates as these provisions are released.
This has been a great discussion today. I think I've actually picked up a few things that I wasn't aware of, received a little more insight into what exactly it was. But just to reiterate exactly what you're saying is that everybody's situation is going to be unique to them. So by just listening to the news, seeing what's happening on there, talk to your planners, talk to your advisors. They're the ones who are going to be the experts on what's happening, what the changes are happening. Talk to them, know what's going on, be able to make the changes now, be proactive in what you're doing, and don't sit back and wait until something happens until it's too late.
Great points. Thank you, Geoff. Thank you, Bob. This was Patrick Carlson, Bob Lepson, and Geoff Turner from Advisor Investments. Thank you again for listening to the Advisor You Can Talk To podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe and review our show. You can also check us out at advisorinvestments.com/podcasts. Your feedback is always welcome, and if you have any questions or topics you'd like us to explore, please email us at info@advisorinvestments.com. Thanks.